The engine sputtered one last time before giving up completely. Tom Davis gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white with frustration, as his old sedan rolled to a silent stop on the shoulder of Route 16. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the asphalt, highlighting the rising steam from his radiator like a distress signal nobody would answer. 20 years in the military, 2 tours overseas, and now he couldn't even make it to a job interview. The irony wasn't lost on him. Tom stepped out, the familiar ache in his left knee, a permanent souvenir from his service days. He glanced down the empty stretch of road, spotting a small garage about half a mile ahead. Carter's Auto Repair read. The weathered sign, its blue paint peeling at the edges, but somehow still standing proud against the elements. With a deep breath, Tom began to push. Each step forward sent sharp pain through his knee, but the car inched along, 1 foot at a time. Sweat beaded on his forehead, his plain button-up shirt, the only decent one he owned, now clinging to his back. The weight of the vehicle seemed to mirror the weight he'd been carrying since returning home, heavy, unrelenting, and impossible to manage alone. Inside Carter's Auto Repair, Jake Carter wiped grease-stained hands on a rag that had seen better days. At 45, the lines around his eyes told stories of engines fixed and lives mended through honest work. The small-town garage wasn't much, but it was his, built from scratch after his father passed, leaving behind nothing but a toolbox. And a dream. The sound of metal scraping against asphalt pulled Jake's attention to the large bay doors. Through the afternoon glare, he saw a man, shoulders hunched with effort, pushing a sedan toward the garage. Without hesitation, Jake dropped his rag and rushed outside. "Hey, hold on there!" Jake called, jogging toward the struggling figure. "Let me help you with that." Together, they guided the car into the garage bay, Tom's labored breathing filling the space between them. Jake noticed the military posture, the disciplined way the stranger carried himself despite his exhaustion, and the slight favoritism of his right leg. "Thanks," Tom managed between breaths, extending a hand. "Tom Davis." "Jake Carter," he replied, his handshake firm and genuine. "What seems to be the trouble?" Tom's eyes darted to the floor, his voice lowering. Radiators shot, engines making sounds no engine should make. He paused, the weight of his next words visible in his hesitation. "Look, I don't have much. Just need to know if it's fixable or if I should start looking for bus schedules." Jake circled the car, popping the hood with practiced ease. The engine told its own story, one of patches upon patches, of making do, of stretching things just a little further. It was a story Jake had seen countless times in this town where prosperity had packed its bags years ago. "Where were you headed?" Jake asked, reaching for a wrench. "Job interview over in Millfield, former army mechanic, but civilian jobs are harder to come by than they tell you." Tom's voice carried no bitterness, just the matter-of-fact tone of a man accustomed to uphill battles. Jake worked in silence for a moment, his mind racing. He'd seen the "Support Our Troops" bumper stickers on countless cars he'd fixed, but here was the real thing, a veteran who had given everything and returned to a country that had little to give back. "Radiators definitely shot," Jake finally said, straightening up. "Engine needs work, too." He wiped his hands again, making a decision that came from somewhere deeper than business sense. "I can have it ready by morning," Tom's expression fell. "I appreciate that, but I can't afford—" Jake held up a hand. "My dad was 101st Airborne, never charged a fellow soldier." He nodded toward a small picture frame on his cluttered desk. "Consider it handled." Their eyes met. Two men who understood the value of hard work and the rarity of genuine kindness. In that moment, neither knew how this chance encounter would change both their lives, setting wheels in motion that would roll far beyond Carter's Auto Repair. "I can't accept this." Tom's voice was steady but strained, a man who had learned to stand tall, even when everything inside him wanted to crumble. The fluorescent lights of the garage cast harsh shadows across his weathered face, highlighting years of discipline and pride now at war with his circumstances. There must be something I can do to pay you back. Jake didn't look up from the radiator he was examining, his hands moving with the confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime speaking the language of broken engines. "Coffee's in the pot over there, if you want to grab us both a cup." "That'd be payment enough." Tom stood frozen, his military posture rigid with indecision. The walls of the small garage were covered with faded photographs of cars Jake had brought back to life, mixed with American flags and service patches, silent witnesses to Jake's respect for those who served. A particular patch caught Tom's eye. 101st Airborne, just like Jake had mentioned about his father. With a deep breath that seemed to carry the weight of surrendered pride, Tom moved toward the coffee pot, his left knee protesting with each step. The simple act of accepting help felt like admitting defeat, something his years in uniform had trained him never to do. "2 tours?" Jake asked casually, glancing up briefly as Tom returned with 2 chipped mugs of steaming coffee. Tom nodded, surprised. "How'd you know?" "The way you favor that knee but refuse to limp, the way you scanned the garage for exits when you first walked in, the 1,000-yard stare when you think no one's looking." Jake took a sip of coffee, his eyes never leaving the engine. "My old man was the same way after Vietnam." The tension in Tom's shoulders eased slightly as he leaned against the workbench, watching Jake's methodical movements. "Afghanistan, then Iraq. Came home to find my wife had moved on. My skills didn't translate, and the country I'd fought for had no place for me anymore." Jake nodded, understanding hanging in the air between them like the smell of oil and metal. "What's the job interview?" "Security position at Millfield Manufacturing. Nothing special, but it's steady work." Tom's fingers tightened around the mug. "Been living out of my car for the past 3 months. This job could change everything." Jake's hand stilled for a moment, the weight of Tom's confession settling in the small space between them. Without comment, he returned to his work, reaching for a socket wrench. "Hand me that gasket, would you?" As night fell outside, the 2 men worked side by side, Jake explaining each repair while Tom's trained eyes followed, occasionally offering insights from his military mechanic days. Stories flowed as freely as the coffee, Jake sharing about building the garage from scratch after his father's passing. Tom recounting the brotherhood he'd found overseas and lost upon returning home. By midnight, the sedan's engine purred like new. Tom stood before it, his expression a mixture of disbelief and something that looked dangerously close to hope. "You didn't have to do this," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion he refused to show. "Most people would have turned me away." Jake wiped his hands on his rag, exhaustion and satisfaction etched across his face. "Most people forget what matters." He glanced at his father's photo on the desk. "Sometimes doing the right thing is enough." The silence that followed was filled with unspoken gratitude, the kind that exists between men who understand that some debts can never be repaid with money, only with the promise to extend the same kindness to another soul in need. As Tom prepared to leave, ready to sleep in his car before tomorrow's interview, Jake placed a hand on his shoulder. "Got a couch in the back office. It's not much, but it's yours if you want it. Gotta make sure you're rested for that interview." Their eyes met, 2 strangers connected by circumstance and something deeper, neither aware that this night was just the beginning of a bond that would change the trajectory of both their lives forever. Dawn broke over the horizon, painting the sky in gentle strokes of pink and gold as Tom Davis stood beside his repaired sedan. The morning air was crisp with promise, carrying the scent of oil and fresh possibility through the open garage doors. Jake emerged from the back office, 2 steaming cups of coffee in hand, his eyes tired but satisfied. "She's all set," Jake said, handing Tom a cup. "New radiator, flush the cooling system, fix that knock in the engine, should get you to your interview with time to spare." Tom ran his hand along the hood of the car, the metal cool beneath his fingertips. His reflection stared back at him from the polished surface, a man given a second chance by a stranger's kindness. The weight of gratitude sat heavy in his chest, too profound for the simple words he had to offer. "I don't know how to thank you," he said finally, his voice barely audible above the distant chirping of morning birds. "What you did here, it's more than just fixing a car." Jake shrugged, the gesture dismissive but his eyes betraying the depth of understanding between them. "Just pay it forward someday. That's all the thanks I need." They stood in comfortable silence, 2 men bound by an unspoken code of honor and service. Tom straightened his shirt, the same one from yesterday, but somehow looking fresher after a night of rest on Jake's office couch. With military precision, he extended his hand. "Good luck with the interview," Jake said, his handshake firm. "You've got this." Tom nodded, words failing him as he slipped into the driver's seat. The engine came to life with a smooth purr that spoke of Jake's skilled handiwork. With one last glance at the mechanic, standing in the doorway of his humble garage, Tom pulled away, his taillights disappearing around the bend as the morning sun climbed higher in the sky. Jake watched until the car was out of sight, a strange mixture of pride and emptiness settling over him. In the grand scheme of things, it was just another repair, another day at Carter's Auto. Yet something about Tom's quiet dignity and the weight of his struggles had left a mark. The day unfolded like any other. Regular customers came and went, bringing their mechanical troubles and small-town gossip. Mrs. Henderson's brake pads needed replacing. Old man Jenkins's pickup truck made that strange clicking sound again. By closing time, the encounter with the veteran had faded to the background of Jake's mind, filed away among the countless other moments of human connection that made up the tapestry of his life. As dusk settled over the garage, Jake wiped down his tools one by one, returning each to its designated place with methodical care. The radio hummed softly in the background, country music mingling with the familiar sounds of the garage winding down for the night. Through the open bay doors, the streetlights flickered to life, casting long shadows across the empty parking lot. Jake flipped the sign from open to closed, his daily ritual marking the transition from mechanic to just another soul trying to make sense of the world. He glanced once more at his father's photograph, the older Carter's eyes seeming to hold approval for the day's good deed. With a sigh of satisfaction, Jake hit the lights and locked up, completely unaware that fate had already set wheels in motion. The simple act of kindness he had offered to a stranger was about to return to him tenfold, in ways he could never have imagined. As night fell completely over the small town, Jake drove home, the headlights of his truck cutting through the darkness. Behind him, the garage stood silent and empty, holding the secret of what tomorrow would bring, a day that would change everything, a day when the ripples of compassion would become waves powerful enough to alter the course of many lives, beginning with his own. Little did Jake know that while he slept, somewhere miles away, decisions were being made, phone calls were being placed, and a plan was taking shape. All because he had chosen to help a veteran in need. "What in the world?" Jake muttered, as the floor beneath him trembled, coffee sloshing over the rim of his chipped mug. The rumbling grew louder, vibrating through the small office where he'd been reviewing invoices since sunrise. His first thought was construction. Maybe the county had finally decided to repave Route 16, but this was different, more purposeful, more directed. Jake set down his mug and moved toward the front of the garage, the sound intensifying with each step. Through the grimy windows, he caught glimpses of something impossible, flashes of green and tan, the unmistakable outline of heavy vehicles moving in formation. His heart quickened as he pushed open the door, squinting against the morning light that suddenly seemed too harsh, too revealing. The sight before him stole his breath away. A convoy of military vehicles stretched down the road as far as he could see. Massive transport trucks with canvas covers, gleaming black SUVs with tinted windows, and Humvees positioned strategically around the perimeter of his humble garage. Soldiers in full uniform stood at attention, their faces stoic and unreadable beneath their caps. American flags rippled from several vehicles, their stars and stripes vivid against the dusty backdrop of his small-town garage. "Carter's Auto Repair?" A commanding voice cut through Jake's stunned silence. Jake turned to find a tall officer approaching, his uniform adorned with ribbons and medals that spoke of years of service and distinction. The man's posture was perfect, his gaze direct and assessing. "Yes," Jake managed, his voice sounding distant to his own ears. "I'm Jake Carter," the officer extended his hand. "Colonel Richard Bennett, United States Army." Jake shook the hand automatically, his mind racing through possibilities. Had something happened to Tom? Was there trouble with his father's military pension? Or worse, had Jake unknowingly done something wrong? "What's this about?" Jake asked, suddenly aware of the curious faces of townspeople gathering at a distance, watching the spectacle unfold. Mrs. Henderson from the diner had her phone out, recording everything. Old man Jenkins stood slack-jawed beside his pickup. In a town where a traffic ticket made the local paper, this was unprecedented. "You serviced a vehicle yesterday," the colonel stated rather than asked. "A 2008 sedan. Driver was Thomas Davis." Jake's stomach tightened. "Is Tom okay? Did something happen at his interview?" The colonel's expression revealed nothing. "Mr. Davis is fine. It's your interaction with him that has brought us here today." Behind the colonel, soldiers began unloading equipment from the trucks, communications gear, folding tables, and what looked like presentation boards covered with black cloth. Jake stepped back, his mind struggling to process the surreal scene playing out in his parking lot. "I don't understand," Jake said, watching as a team of soldiers efficiently transformed the space around his garage into what resembled a military command post. "I just fixed his car. He needed help. I helped him, that's all." The colonel studied Jake for a long moment, his eyes measuring something only he could see. "That's precisely why we're here, Mr. Carter. Just helping isn't as simple as you might think." A second black SUV pulled up, its engine quieter than the others despite its size. The soldiers straightened imperceptibly as the back door opened. Jake found himself holding his breath, anticipation and confusion warring within him as a figure emerged from the vehicle. "Am I in some kind of trouble?" Jake asked, his voice barely audible over the continued activity around him. The colonel's expression softened slightly, the first hint of humanity beneath the military exterior. "Quite the opposite, Mr. Carter, but I'm not authorized to explain further." He checked his watch with practiced precision. "All will become clear in approximately 3 minutes." Jake stood frozen in place, the morning sun now high overhead, casting no shadows for him to hide in. His small-town life, his routine existence, had been interrupted by something beyond his understanding, something that had begun with a simple act of kindness toward a stranger in need. And somehow, deep in his gut, Jake knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The air seemed to still as the third vehicle in the convoy, a polished black SUV with tinted windows, rolled to a silent stop directly in front of Jake's garage. Unlike the others, this one bore small flags on its hood, fluttering in the morning breeze. The insignia was unmistakable even to Jake's civilian eyes, stars that signified someone of considerable rank. Jake's heart hammered against his ribs as the driver, a young soldier with a perfectly pressed uniform, stepped out and opened the rear passenger door with ceremonial precision. First emerged a pair of polished leather shoes, then pressed trousers with a crisp gold stripe running down each leg, and finally the full figure of a man whose very presence commanded attention. Colonel James Adams, Special Operations Command. The Colonel Richard Bennett announced, his voice carrying across the now silent parking lot. Colonel Adams stood tall, his chest adorned with rows of ribbons and medals that told stories of valor Jake could only imagine. His silver hair was cut with military precision, his eyes sharp and assessing as they took in the humble garage and the man who owned it. But it was not the Colonel's impressive appearance that caused Jake's breath to catch in his throat. It was the figure who emerged from the vehicle behind him, Tom Davis, but not the Tom Davis of yesterday, with his worn clothes and defeated posture. This Tom Davis stood ramrod straight in a full dress uniform, gleaming with medals and insignia, his previously tired eyes now clear and focused, his expression unreadable. Gone was any trace of the man who had pushed his broken-down car into Jake's garage less than 24 hours ago. "What the hell?" Jake whispered, too stunned to maintain any semblance of decorum. Tom's eyes met Jake's briefly, something unspoken passing between them, an apology, perhaps, or a request for understanding. Then his gaze snapped forward again. The perfect picture of military discipline. Colonel Adams approached Jake with measured steps, each one deliberate and purposeful. The curious townspeople had grown in number, their whispers creating a backdrop of anticipation that hung in the air like summer heat. "Mr. Carter," Colonel Adams said, his voice deep and resonant with authority. "I understand you're confused by our presence here today." Jake nodded, words failing him as he tried to reconcile the disheveled veteran of yesterday with the decorated soldier now standing before him. Had it all been some sort of test? A setup? The thought sent a chill through him despite the warming. "Day, your actions yesterday have brought you to our attention," Colonel Adams continued. "Special attention, I might add." Jake found his voice at last. "I just fixed his car," he said, gesturing toward Tom. "That's all I did." Colonel Adams's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "No, Mr. Carter. What you did was demonstrate the kind of character this country was built on, the kind that's become increasingly rare." He glanced at Tom, who remained perfectly still, then back to Jake. "Major Davis wasn't just any stranded motorist. Major." The rank hit Jake like a physical blow. Tom, no, Major Davis, hadn't been a down-on-his-luck veteran at all. "I don't understand," Jake said, aware that the entire town seemed to be watching now, phones recording what would surely become local legend by nightfall. Was this some kind of setup? Colonel Adams's eyes narrowed slightly, assessing Jake with new interest. "I believe we should continue this conversation privately." He gestured toward Jake's office. "We need to talk." Behind them, soldiers continued, setting up equipment with efficiency that spoke of years of training. Whatever was happening, Jake realized, had been planned with military precision. And somehow he, a small-town mechanic who had simply done what his father would have expected of him, was at the center of it all. With one last bewildered glance at the transformed Major Davis, Jake led Colonel Adams toward his office. Each step taking him further from the life he had known and toward something he couldn't begin to comprehend. The office door clicked shut behind them, sealing away the commotion outside. Jake's small workspace, usually cluttered with invoices and spare parts catalogs, now seemed impossibly cramped with Colonel Adams's commanding presence filling a room. Major Davis stood at parade rest near the window, sunlight glinting off the medals adorning his chest. "Please, sit down, Mr. Carter," Colonel Adams gestured to Jake's worn office chair. Jake hesitated, then sank into it, feeling strangely like a visitor in his own garage. "I think you owe me an explanation," Jake said, his voice steadier than he felt. "Who are you people, really? And what does any of this have to do with me fixing a radiator?" Major Davis's eyes met Jake's, and for the first time since his transformation, Jake caught a glimpse of the man he'd helped yesterday, vulnerability, bleeding through the military bearing. "Permission to speak freely, sir?" Davis asked, his question directed at Colonel Adams. The colonel nodded once, his expression softening. "Tell him everything, Tom. He deserves that much." Major Davis took a deep breath, his shoulders squaring, as if preparing to shoulder a heavy load. "My name is Major Thomas Davis, 5th Special Forces Group. What I told you about my service wasn't a lie. 2 tours, Afghanistan and Iraq." He paused, his eyes dropping momentarily to the floor. "What I didn't tell you is what happened during those tours." Colonel Adams pulled a folder from his briefcase, sliding it across the desk to Jake. Inside was a newspaper clipping with a headline that made Jake's breath catch. "American Soldier Saves 12 in Daring Rescue." 3 years ago, Major Davis led a mission that saved 12 hostages from an insurgent stronghold, Colonel Adams explained. Enemy fire was intense. The extraction helicopter was hit. Davis stayed behind, providing cover fire while the wounded were evacuated. He sustained injuries to his left knee and back, but continued fighting until every American was safely away. Jake looked up from the article to Major Davis, seeing his quiet demeanor in a new light. "You're a hero." Davis shook his head. "I'm a soldier who did his job." He was awarded the Silver Star, Colonel Adams continued. But when he returned home, things deteriorated. The colonel's voice held an edge of regret. The military failed him. The system failed him. Davis's jaw tightened. PTSD, couldn't sleep. Wife left, started missing appointments at the VA. Eventually, I just disappeared. Couldn't face any of it anymore. "We've been looking for him for months," Colonel Adams said, his eyes fixed on Jake. "A soldier like Major Davis doesn't just get forgotten. His unit has been searching, following leads, trying to bring him back into the fold." Jake struggled to process it all. The broken man who had pushed his car into the garage yesterday was actually a war hero, lost and adrift in the very country he had risked everything to protect. "Your kindness," Davis said, his voice rough with emotion. "It was the first real human connection I'd had in months. Something about the way you helped without question. It reminded me of what brotherhood feels like." He swallowed hard. "After I left your garage, I pulled over and called my former commander. I was ready to come back." Colonel Adams leaned forward, his expression intense. "Mr. Carter, you have no idea what you've done. Your simple act of compassion accomplished what months of searching couldn't. You reminded one of our finest what it means to be part of something greater than himself." Jake shook his head, overwhelmed. "I just fixed his car. Anyone would have done the same." "No," Davis said firmly, "they wouldn't. I pushed that car 5 miles before reaching your garage, past 3 other shops on the way. No one else even offered to help." Outside, the sounds of the military convoy hummed like a living organism. Jake could see the townspeople still gathered, watching in awe as the unprecedented scene unfolded around his humble garage. "You sparked something," Colonel Adams said, his voice quiet but powerful. "A chain reaction that brought one of our best. We're back from the brink, and for that, Mr. Carter, the United States military owes you a debt of honor." The room fell silent as Jake absorbed the weight of Colonel Adams's words. Outside, the military convoy continued its organized chaos, the soldiers moving with purpose around his small garage. The morning sun now streamed fully through the office window, illuminating floating dust particles that danced between the 3 men. A mechanic and 2 soldiers bound together by an act of kindness that had rippled farther than any of them could have anticipated. Colonel Adams reached into his briefcase again, this time retrieving a sleek leather portfolio emblazoned with an emblem Jake didn't recognize. A wrench crossed with a sword beneath an American eagle. Mr. Carter, are you familiar with Operation Second Chance? The colonel asked, placing the portfolio on the desk between them. Jake shook his head, his calloused fingers drumming nervously on his knee. Can't say that I am. It's a program we established 2 years ago, Major Davis explained, his voice taking on a new tone, professional yet passionate. After my experiences, I realized how many veterans fall through the cracks when they return home, especially those with specialized skills that don't always translate to civilian life. Colonel Adams nodded, opening the portfolio to reveal official-looking documents bearing Department of Defense letterhead. Operation Second Chance identifies veterans in transition and provides practical support, housing assistance, job placement, medical care. One of our biggest challenges has been transportation. Many vets can't afford reliable vehicles, Major Davis continued, or they can't afford to maintain what they have. It might seem small to some people, but without reliable transportation, you can't get to job interviews, medical appointments, or support groups, Jake finished, understanding dawning in his eyes. You can't rebuild a life if you can't even get from point A to point B. Exactly, Colonel Adams said, a hint of approval in his voice. Which brings us to why we're here. He slid the documents toward Jake. Operation Second Chance needs mechanics we can trust, professionals who understand both vehicles and the unique challenges our veterans face. Jake stared at the papers, the words blurring slightly as he tried to comprehend what was happening. You want me to fix cars for veterans? Major Davis stepped forward, his military bearing momentarily giving way to the vulnerable man Jake had first met. We want to offer you a contract, Mr. Carter. The military would provide funding for you to repair and maintain vehicles for veterans in transition, right here from your own garage. You'd be compensated fairly, of course, and provided with all necessary parts and equipment. Jake's heart pounded as his eyes scanned the document, figures that made his yearly income look like pocket change, terms that spoke of purpose rather than just profit. This is too much, he managed, looking up at the two men. All I did was help someone who needed it. That doesn't warrant this. Colonel Adams's expression softened, revealing the man beneath the uniform. Mr. Carter, do you know how rare your kind of decency has become? You helped a stranger with no expectation of reward, no ulterior motive. That's exactly the kind of person we want working with our veterans. Major Davis placed a hand on Jake's shoulder, the gesture of a man who knew the value of human connection. Your father was 101st Airborne. You told me he never charged a fellow soldier. His voice quieted. This program would let you continue that legacy on a scale you never imagined possible. Through the window, Jake could see the curious townspeople still gathered, witnessing a moment they couldn't possibly understand. His small garage, the legacy his father had left him, suddenly seemed poised on the edge of becoming something much greater. You have a gift, Mr. Carter, Colonel Adams said, his voice carrying the weight of authority and sincerity. Not just for fixing engines, but for restoring faith. Operation Second Chance wants to help you share that gift with the men and women who need it most. Jake's eyes moved from the contract to his father's photograph on the wall, the old man's eyes seeming to shine with approval from across the years. His simple act of kindness had somehow set in motion events beyond his wildest imagination, a ripple that had returned to him as a wave of opportunity and purpose. The contract sat signed on Jake's weathered desk, the ink still drying on a signature that would forever divide his life into before and after. Outside, the military convoy that had descended upon his small-town garage just hours ago was now dispersing with the same precision with which it had arrived. Colonel Adams stood in the doorway, his hand extended toward Jake. Welcome to Operation Second Chance, Mr. Carter. he said, his firm handshake sealing more than just a business arrangement. "I have a feeling this is the beginning of something extraordinary." Jake nodded, still unable to fully comprehend how fixing one radiator had cascaded into this moment. "I'll do my best not to let you down, sir. That's all anyone can ask." The Irish colonel replied, turning to rejoin his men. Major Davis lingered behind, his military bearing softened by the hint of a smile. "You know, when I pushed my car into your garage yesterday, I was at my lowest point. I had no idea I was about to meet the man who would help change not just my life, but the lives of countless others." Jake watched as the last of the military vehicles pulled away, leaving behind only a small team of contractors who were already unloading equipment from unmarked vans. "I'm still not sure I deserve all this," he admitted. Davis placed a hand on Jake's shoulder. "The best people never think they deserve recognition. That's exactly why they're worthy of it." With a final nod of respect, he departed, leaving Jake alone with the empty garage that would soon become something far greater than he had ever imagined. The transformation began immediately. By sunset, new diagnostic equipment had been installed, the computer system upgraded, and the supply room restocked with parts that Jake had only dreamed of having on hand. The Operation's Second Chance emblem now hung proudly beside his father's photograph, two legacies merged into one. Word spread through the military community with remarkable speed. The first veterans began arriving within days, men and women with stories etched into their faces and vehicles that mirrored their struggles. A young Marine with haunted eyes and a truck that wouldn't start, an Air Force technician with trembling hands, and a van with transmission problems that had cost him 3 job interviews. A Navy veteran raising 3 kids alone after losing her husband, driving a sedan with brake issues she couldn't afford to fix. Jake listened to each story as carefully as he listened to each engine, understanding that sometimes the mechanical problems were easier to solve than the human ones. But with each repair, each vehicle restored to reliable service, he witnessed small miracles of relief and gratitude that filled the garage with a new kind of energy. The local newspaper ran a story about the transformation of Carter's auto repair into what they called the Soldier's Garage. The article brought curious visitors from neighboring towns, some offering donations, others volunteering their time. Jake found himself at the center of a growing community, united by a simple belief that those who had served deserved more than just thanks. They deserved tangible support. 3 months after the convoy had appeared in his parking lot, Jake stood in the doorway of his garage, surveying the scene before him. 4 vehicles were in various stages of repair, each representing a veteran's journey back to stability. 2 former soldiers who had initially come for repairs were now working alongside him, their mechanical skills finding purpose in helping others like themselves. The smell of oil and metal still filled the air, but it was now mingled with the aroma of coffee from the small meeting area in the corner where veterans gathered to share stories and resources. What had once been a simple auto repair shop had evolved into something that defied easy classification: part garage, part community center, part healing space. As he watched a young veteran drive away in a now reliable car, headed to his first job interview in months, Jake thought about the ripple effect of kindness. His father had taught him that fixing cars was about more than just engines and parts. It was about getting people back on the road to wherever they needed to go. Now, in ways he could never have foreseen, Jake was helping America's heroes find their way home. And in doing so, he had discovered a purpose that made every morning worth waking up for. The bell above the door jingled softly as the mail carrier entered Carter's garage, now bustling with activity on a crisp autumn morning. 2 veterans in matching coveralls worked beneath a lifted truck, their friendly banter mixing with the rhythmic sounds of wrenches and socket drivers. In the corner, a small group gathered around a coffee pot. Maps spread across the table as they planned a motorcycle ride to raise funds for homeless veterans. "Package for you, Jake," the mail carrier called, hefting a small brown parcel. "Looks official, military postmark." Jake wiped his hands on a shop rag as he emerged from beneath a sedan with Virginia plates. In the 6 months since Operation Second Chance had transformed his garage, he'd developed a routine of controlled chaos that somehow worked perfectly. Every day brought new challenges, new vehicles, and new stories of struggle and triumph. "Thanks, Ellie," he said, taking the package with curiosity. It was heavier than its size suggested, wrapped in brown paper with precise corners that spoke of military precision. Jake carried it to his office, now organized and efficient where it had once been cluttered, and closed the door behind him. His father's photograph had been joined by dozens more, snapshots of veterans standing proudly beside their repaired vehicles, group photos from community events, newspaper clippings documenting the impact of what the town now affectionately called the Hero's Garage. With careful fingers, Jake unwrapped the package to reveal a small wooden box polished to a high shine. Atop it rested an envelope bearing his name in meticulous handwriting. He recognized the penmanship immediately, Major Thomas Davis. The letter. Inside was written on crisp stationery, each line as straight and disciplined as the man who had penned it. "Dear Jake, they say the smallest actions often create the largest ripples. 6 months ago, I pushed a broken-down car into your garage, a man at the end of his rope. What I found there wasn't just a mechanic, but a reminder of what humanity should be. I want you to know where your kindness led. After reconnecting with my unit, I accepted a position training new recruits. Every day I share not just military tactics, but lessons about brotherhood and service. Your name comes up often in my stories, the civilian who embodied military values without ever wearing the uniform. When I told my commanding officer about you, he said something I'll never forget. Some people serve their country by fighting its battles. Others serve by reminding us what we're fighting for. You, Jake Carter, are the latter. The program you've helped build has now expanded to 3 other states. Over 400 veterans have received assistance with transportation issues. That's 400 lives changed because you decided to help one stranger without asking for anything in return. Enclosed in this box is something I've carried since my first tour. It's a challenge coin given to me by a commander who saved my life in Kandahar. He told me to pass it on someday to someone who embodied the values it represents. There is no one more deserving than you. With deepest respect and gratitude, Major. Thomas Davis, 5th Special Forces Group. Jake's vision blurred as he opened the wooden box. Nestled in velvet lay a heavy metal coin, its surface worn from years of being carried. One side bore the insignia of the 5th Special Forces Group, the other, a simple inscription, "Deeds, not words." He turned the coin in his palm, feeling its weight, not just the physical heft of metal, but the weight of honor and brotherhood it represented. In his small-town garage, fixing a stranger's car had seemed like the most natural thing in the world. He hadn't expected recognition, hadn't sought praise. He had simply done what his father would have expected of him. Through the office window, Jake watched the veterans working in his garage, men and women who had found purpose again through the simple dignity of meaningful work and community. Some had come for repairs and stayed to help others. Others had found jobs through the network that had organically grown around the program. Jake placed the coin carefully on his desk, beside the photograph of his father. The 2 symbols of service, one military, one civilian, seemed to complement each other perfectly, bridging worlds that were perhaps not so different after all. Outside his office, a new vehicle pulled into the garage, an old pickup truck backfiring loudly. Jake tucked the letter into his pocket and slipped the challenge coin beside it. As he stepped out to greet the newcomer, he carried with him the tangible reminder that in a world often divided by differences, acts of kindness remain the most powerful common language, and sometimes fixing a broken radiator could mend much more than just an engine. Sunset painted the sky in brilliant hues of orange and purple as Jake Carter stood in the doorway of his garage, watching the day's last repaired vehicle drive away. The driver, a young veteran with a prosthetic leg and a newfound smile, honked twice in farewell, his sedan no longer sputtering but purring with renewed life. Jake's fingers absently traced the outline of the challenge coin in his pocket, its metal warm from being carried close to his heart each day since its arrival. The garage that had once been simply his livelihood had transformed into something far greater. A beacon of hope, a place of healing, a community that extended far beyond oil changes and tire rotations. A year ago, he had been just a small-town mechanic following his father's simple creed: do good work, treat people fairly, and help when you can. He never could have imagined how profoundly one act of kindness, helping a stranger with a broken-down car, would alter the trajectory of so many lives, including his own. The Operation Second Chance program had now spread to 17 states, with Jake's garage serving as the blueprint. Thousands of veterans had received the helping hand they needed to rebuild their lives, one reliable vehicle at a time. What had begun with a radiator repair had blossomed into a movement that refused to let those who served be forgotten when they returned home. Jake had never sought recognition for what he'd done. The local newspaper awards, the letter from the governor, even the invitation to the White House, none of these external validations compared to the quiet satisfaction of seeing a veteran drive away with renewed independence and dignity. The true reward had been witnessing how kindness, once set in motion, created ripples that expanded far beyond anything he could have anticipated. As darkness fell and the garage lights cast a warm glow onto the empty parking lot, Jake thought about tomorrow's appointments. 6 more veterans, 6 more stories, 6 more opportunities to make a difference. He thought about Major Davis, now leading the national expansion of the program, and how their chance encounter had sparked something neither man could have created alone. In a world that often rushed past those who struggled, Jake had simply chosen to stop and help. No cameras had been rolling, no audience had been watching, no reward had been promised. He had acted out of the simple belief that it was the right thing to do. And in that ordinary moment of extraordinary kindness, he had changed everything for. Sometimes the most powerful acts are the ones done when no one is watching. Sometimes the most meaningful help comes with no expectation of return. And sometimes the simple decision to be the person who stops, who sees the struggle of another, and responds with compassion, can create ripples that become waves, waves that become tides, tides that change the landscape of countless lives.